Every parent knows the weight of watching your child slip away from you, word by word, smile by smile. For Daniel Holt, that weight had become unbearable since his wife's death, left him alone to raise a daughter who no longer spoke. One rainy night on a mountain road, an injured dog appears and refuses his help. Instead, the dog walks away, looking back as if asking Daniel to follow. What the dog leads him to is a hidden cabin with journals, old inventions, and a vault containing 120 million in missing technology. The cabin belonged to a man who vanished decades ago, leaving behind secrets that could change everything. But corporate hunters are closing in, and Daniel must decide what matters more: the money that could save his family, or the trust of a daughter who's already lost too much. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes a wounded animal knows exactly where a wounded man needs to go. Will following this mysterious dog lead Daniel to the answers he's been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Holt had once believed that life followed a predictable rhythm: wake up, save lives, come home to his family, repeat. For 12 years, as a paramedic in the mountain towns of northern Idaho, that rhythm had sustained him through the hardest calls, the longest shifts, and the weight of carrying other people's emergencies on his shoulders. Sarah used to joke that he had a superhero complex, always rushing off to rescue strangers, while she handled the real heroics at home with their daughter Meera. The photo on his dashboard still showed the three of them from last Christmas, Sarah's auburn hair catching the morning light, as she laughed at something Meera had whispered in her ear. Their 8-year-old daughter's gap-toothed grin, wide with mischief. Daniel remembered taking that picture, remembered thinking he was the luckiest man alive. The frame was cracked now, a spiderweb of lines running through Sarah's face from when he'd slammed his palm against the dashboard 3 months ago, screaming at a God who didn't seem to be listening. 3 months. That's how long it had been since the accident that changed everything. Sarah had been driving to pick up Meera from school when a teenager, texting behind the wheel, ran a red light at 45 miles per hour. The impact killed Sarah instantly, the doctors said. She wouldn't have felt any pain. They meant it as comfort. But Daniel knew better. The pain belonged to the living. Meera had been in the back seat. Physically, she'd escaped with minor bruises and a small scar on her forehead that would fade with time. Emotionally, she'd retreated so far inside herself that some days Daniel wondered if she'd ever find her way back. The little girl who used to chatter non-stop about her day, who made up elaborate stories about the squirrels in their backyard, who sang off-key lullabies to her stuffed animals, the child had vanished as completely as if she'd been the one who died in the crash. The silence in their house had become a living thing, heavy and oppressive, filling every room with the weight of unspoken grief. Daniel would come home from shifts to find Meera sitting exactly where he'd left her, staring at the same page of a book she wasn't reading, or holding a crayon over a coloring page she'd never touch. He'd tried everything: child psychologists, art therapy, even a service dog the therapist recommended. Nothing worked. Meera ate when food was placed in front of her, slept when tucked into bed, and moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. The financial pressure had started almost immediately. Sarah's life insurance would help, eventually, but insurance companies moved at their own pace, while bills arrived with clockwork precision. The medical expenses from the accident had been staggering even with insurance. The out-of-pocket costs had drained their savings. Sarah had handled their finances, had been the organized one who paid bills on time and balanced their checkbook to the penny. Daniel discovered, too late, how much he'd depended on her for the mundane details that kept their life running smoothly. He'd had to reduce his hours at work to care for Meera, which meant less income exactly when he needed more. The mortgage payments were falling behind. The electricity bill sat unopened on the kitchen counter. He couldn't bear to see another red notice. His supervisor, Tom Bradley, had been understanding at first, even sympathetic. But the department couldn't run short-handed indefinitely, and Daniel's heart wasn't in the work anymore. How could he save other people's lives when he'd failed to save the most important life in his world? The guilt was the worst part. He'd been at work when the accident happened, responding to a call about a construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding. A routine rescue that kept him busy for 2 hours while his wife and daughter drove across town on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. If he'd been home, if he'd picked up Meera himself, if he'd called Sarah just 5 minutes earlier, or later the if-only scenarios played in his mind like a broken record, each one ending with the same devastating conclusion. Their house, once filled with Sarah's laughter and Meera's chatter, had become a museum of memories neither of them could bear to face. Sarah's coffee mug still sat in the sink, the one with the faded "World's Best Mom" lettering that Meera had given her for Mother's Day 2 years ago. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished novel she'd never complete. Her clothes still hung in the closet because Daniel couldn't bring himself to pack them away, and every morning the sight of her empty side of the bed hit him like a fresh wound. Meera's room had become a shrine to the child she used to be. Her art supplies sat untouched on the desk where she'd once created masterpieces that Sarah would proudly display on the refrigerator. Her favorite books gathered dust on shelves where they'd once been read and reread until the spines were cracked and the pages soft from handling. Even her stuffed animals seemed to sense the change. They sat in perfect rows along her bed, no longer dragged around the house on grand adventures or included in elaborate tea parties. Daniel had tried to reach his daughter in every way he could think of. He'd read her bedtime stories she didn't respond to, cooked her favorite meals she barely touched, and planned activities she participated in with mechanical compliance, but no joy. The child psychologist, Dr. Martinez, had explained that some children process trauma by shutting down completely, creating a protective shell around their emotions until they felt safe enough to emerge. But how long was too long? How much silence could a father endure before he started to disappear himself? The breaking point had come the previous week when Daniel found Meera's journal, the one Dr. Martinez had encouraged her to write in as a way to express feelings she couldn't speak aloud. Page after page was blank except for a single entry, written in her careful third-grade handwriting. "I miss Mommy, but Daddy is too sad to talk about her." The words had hit him harder than any physical blow. The realization that his own grief was somehow making things worse for the one person he was supposed to protect. That night, Daniel had sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot after his shift, staring at his phone and scrolling through old videos of Meera. There was one from her 7th birthday, where she was explaining to the camera how she was going to become a veterinarian who specialized in helping sad animals feel better. Her voice was so bright, so full of certainty about the future, that watching it felt like looking at a stranger. Where had that confident, chattering little girl gone? And how could he bring her back when he wasn't sure he remembered how to be himself anymore? The insurance adjuster had called that morning with more bad news. Sarah's settlement would be smaller than expected due to some technicality in the policy language that Daniel didn't understand but couldn't afford to fight. The teenager who'd caused the accident was uninsured. His family had no assets worth pursuing, and Daniel's lawyer had gently suggested that sometimes justice and financial compensation weren't the same thing. Another door closing, another option eliminated. He'd considered selling the house, but the market was soft and they owed more than it was worth. He'd priced Sarah's jewelry, including her wedding ring, but couldn't bring himself to actually part with it. These weren't just possessions, they were the last, tangible connections to the life they'd built together, the evidence that their happiness had been real, even if it was gone now. Daniel's own wedding ring had grown loose on his finger from the weight he'd lost since the accident. He'd started sliding it up and down his finger unconsciously, a nervous habit that appeared during his worst moments of anxiety. Sometimes he caught himself doing it while staring at nothing, lost in memories or fears about the future, and wondered if this was how people slowly lost their mind-sown, distracted moment at a time. The rain that night had started during his shift, a steady Idaho mountain downpour that turned the winding roads treacherous and made every emergency call more dangerous. He'd been driving home through the canyon, past the dense forests and steep drop-offs that had once seemed beautiful but now reminded him of how quickly everything could change. His windshield wipers had been fighting a losing battle against the storm, and his headlights barely cut through the darkness when the dog appeared in his headlight beam like something from a dream. Daniel had slammed on his brakes, his truck sliding slightly on the wet asphalt before coming to a stop just feet from the animal. His heart was pounding from the near miss, adrenaline flooding his system the way it did during the worst emergency calls. But as he sat there, engine idling and hazard lights blinking, something about the dog's behavior struck him as strange. It wasn't running away or cowering from the truck's lights. Instead, it stood in the middle of the road, looking directly at him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The dog was medium-sized, with thick fur that was matted and wet from the rain. Even from inside his truck, Daniel could see it was injured. There was something wrong with its right front leg, and it held itself with the careful posture of an animal in pain. But instead of seeking help or fleeing from the perceived threat of his vehicle, the dog simply watched him with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths Daniel couldn't fathom. When Daniel rolled down his window to call out to the animal, offering help or at least attempting to coax it off the dangerous road, the dog had done something extraordinary. It turned away from him, limped several steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back over its shoulder. The message was unmistakable: follow me. Daniel had hesitated, thinking of Meera waiting at home with the elderly neighbor who watched her during his evening shifts. Mrs. Chen was kind, but growing frail, and Daniel never liked leaving Meera longer than necessary. He had responsibilities, routines, the careful structure he'd built to keep their small world from falling apart completely. Following a strange dog into the dark forest went against every practical instinct he'd developed as both a father and a first responder. But as he sat there in the rain, something deeper than logic stirred in his chest. For months, he'd been going through the motions of living without really being alive, taking care of Meera's physical needs while both of them slowly suffocated in their shared grief. When was the last time he'd felt genuinely curious about anything? When had he last made a decision based on instinct rather than obligation? The dog waited patiently, as if it understood his internal struggle and was willing to give him the time he needed to choose. Perhaps it was exhaustion or desperation, or simply the recognition that his current path wasn't working anyway. But something in the dog's patient stance, in the way it had appeared exactly when Daniel felt most lost, suggested that this moment was important in a way he couldn't yet understand. Against all reasonable judgment, Daniel turned off his truck's engine, grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the storm. The forest seemed to swallow Daniel's flashlight beam as he followed the dog deeper into the wilderness than any rational person should venture. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but the canopy above was so thick that only scattered drops made it through to the forest floor. Each step took him further from the road, from his truck, from the predictable world of responsibilities and grief that had defined his existence for the past 3 months. The dog moved with surprising grace despite its obvious injury, picking its way carefully over fallen logs and around massive boulders that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. Daniel found himself studying the animal's movement, his paramedic training automatically cataloging signs of distress or pain. The limp was real. He could see the dog favoring its right front paw, but there was something about its overall demeanor that didn't match a typical injured animal. It moved with purpose, with a destination in mind, pausing occasionally to ensure Daniel was still following, but never showing the panic or confusion he'd expect from a lost or wounded creature. The deeper they went, the more surreal the journey became. The trees here were older than anything Daniel had seen in his years of hiking these mountains, their trunks so massive that his flashlight couldn't illuminate their full circumference. The air itself felt different, thicker, somehow charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the cool dampness. It was as if they'd crossed some invisible boundary into a place where the normal rules didn't quite apply. 20 minutes into their trek, Daniel began to question his sanity. What kind of responsible father abandoned his truck on a mountain road to chase a mysterious dog through an unknown forest? Meera was waiting for him at home, probably already asleep, but possibly lying awake, wondering where he was. Mrs. Chen would be getting worried, checking the clock and wondering if she should call someone. His cell phone had lost signal miles back, cutting him off from any way to explain or call for help if something went wrong. But every time doubt crept in, the dog would pause and look back at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Daniel would find himself continuing forward. There was something about the animal's gaze that seemed to communicate more than mere animal instinct, a kind of ancient wisdom that suggested this journey was necessary in ways Daniel couldn't yet understand. The terrain began to change as they climbed higher, the forest floor becoming softer underfoot with decades of accumulated pine needles and decomposing leaves. The sound of their passage was muffled, as if the earth itself was absorbing every footstep and leaving no trace of their passage. Daniel's flashlight began to dim, the batteries wearing down, but somehow the darkness didn't feel threatening. If anything, it felt protective, like a blanket wrapped around secrets that had been waiting patiently to be discovered. Then, just as Daniel was beginning to worry about finding his way back in the dark, the dog stopped. They stood at the edge of a small clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle around a structure that shouldn't have existed. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a moss-covered hill or natural formation, but as Daniel's eyes adjusted to the filtered moonlight, he began to make out the straight lines and right angles that nature never produces. It was a cabin, so overgrown and weathered that it had nearly returned to the earth. Vines covered most of the walls, and what had once been a roof was now a garden of ferns and small saplings that had taken root in the accumulated soil and debris. The structure seemed to have been absorbed by the forest itself, as if the boundary between human construction and natural growth had dissolved over the years. The dog walked directly to what Daniel gradually recognized as a door, though it was so covered in vegetation that it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding wall. The animal sat down and looked expectantly at Daniel, its message clear. This was their destination. Daniel approached the cabin slowly, his flashlight revealing details that became more intriguing with each step. The construction was solid. Whoever had built this place had done so with the intention of it lasting. The logs were thick and expertly fitted, and despite years of neglect, the basic structure remained sound. Windows that had once let in light were now dark rectangles partially obscured by ivy, giving the building the appearance of a face with half-closed eyes. The door was secured with a simple latch that moved easily despite the rust and accumulated grime. As Daniel lifted it, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if he was about to open a book that had been waiting decades for the right reader. The hinges protested with a groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence, and then the door swung open to reveal a darkness so complete that his failing flashlight barely penetrated it. The smell that emerged was not the mustiness Daniel expected from an abandoned building. Instead, there was something almost pleasant about it, a mixture of old wood, dried herbs, and something else he couldn't identify, but that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop. The air was surprisingly fresh, as if the cabin had somehow maintained its own atmosphere separate from the outside world. Daniel stepped across the threshold and immediately felt a shift in temperature. The inside of the cabin was warmer than the forest, and there was no dampness despite the rain and the obvious age of the structure. His flashlight beam revealed a single room that was larger than the exterior had suggested, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and handmade furniture arranged with the careful precision of someone who had lived alone but lived well. The dog entered behind him and immediately moved to a spot near the fireplace, settling down with a sigh of contentment that suggested familiarity. This wasn't the first time the animal had been in this place. It was coming home. As Daniel's eyes adjusted to the darkness, more details emerged. The cabin wasn't abandoned in the way he'd expected. While dust covered most surfaces, the furniture was intact, and arranged as if someone had simply stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. Books lined shelves along the walls, their spines bearing titles Daniel couldn't read in the dim light. A desk sat beneath one of the ivy-covered windows, its surface clear, except for what appeared to be a leather-bound journal lying open as if someone had been interrupted mid-sentence. The sense of presence was overwhelming. Not the creepy feeling of a haunted place, but the warm sensation of a home where someone had lived fully and peacefully. Every object seemed to have been placed with intention. Every corner of the room spoke of a life lived deliberately and without haste. It was the kind of space Daniel had always imagined he might create someday, when he had time to slow down and really think about what mattered. Moving closer to the desk, Daniel's flashlight illuminated the open journal. The handwriting was precise and elegant, written in fountain pen ink that had faded to a warm brown. The entry was dated 23 years ago, and even in the poor light, Daniel could make out the first few lines. "The corporations are closing in, and I fear my time here is running short. If someone finds this record, I hope they will understand that what I've discovered was never meant for profit, but for the preservation of life itself." Daniel's heart began to race as the implications sank in. This wasn't just an abandoned cabinet, it was a time capsule, a deliberately preserved record of someone's life and work. The dog watched him from its spot by the fireplace, and in the dim light, Daniel could swear the animal was smiling. Whatever had led him here, whoever had once called this place home, his arrival was no accident. The journal beckoned, promising answers to questions Daniel hadn't even known he should ask. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cabin, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and mystery of someone's carefully preserved life, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of genuine curiosity and the first faint hope that his own story might not be over after all. Daniel spent the next hour reading by the flickering light of his dying flashlight, completely absorbed in the careful script of Professor Edmund Hartwell. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to solving what he called humanity's greatest challenge, the development of clean, limitless energy that could lift the world from its dependence on fossil fuels. Hartwell's background emerged through scattered personal references and detailed scientific observations. He had been a professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University, but his real passion lay in experimental physics and chemistry. The early entries, dating back nearly 30 years, described his growing frustration with academic politics and corporate influence over research funding. "They want incremental improvements to existing technologies," he had written. "They fear genuine breakthroughs because revolution threatens their carefully constructed empires." The scientific details were far beyond Daniel's understanding, but Hartwell's passion came through clearly in every line. He wrote about molecular structures and energy storage with the enthusiasm most people reserved for their hobbies, describing failed experiments not as setbacks but as stepping stones toward eventual success. His dedication was absolute, 16-hour days in the laboratory, weekends spent testing theories that his colleagues dismissed as impossible, vacation time used to attend obscure conferences where other fringe scientists presented their unconventional ideas. The breakthrough had come 15 years into his research, according to the journal. Hartwell had discovered a way to create what he called molecular batteries, energy storage devices, so efficient they could power a house for months, using no more raw material than a standard car battery. The implications were staggering. A single device could eliminate a family's dependence on the electrical grid. Scaled up, the technology could provide clean energy to entire cities without the massive infrastructure currently required. But with the breakthrough came unexpected attention. Hartwell's journal entries began to reflect growing paranoia as major energy corporations started showing interest in his work. "They don't want to develop the technology," he wrote. "They want to buy it and bury it. A scientist at Shell offered me $50 million for my research, with the clear understanding that development would be delayed indefinitely. When I refused, he suggested that patents could be tied up in legal challenges for decades. The dog had moved closer while Daniel read, settling at his feet with the comfortable familiarity of a long-time companion. Occasionally, Daniel would reach down to stroke the animal's fur, and each time he was struck by how soft and warm it was, despite the obvious age and the harsh conditions of living wild in the forest. The dog's breathing was steady and peaceful, as if listening to Hartwell's words being read aloud brought it comfort. As the entries progressed, Hartwell's situation became increasingly desperate. Corporate representatives had begun appearing at his university office, making offers that grew larger and more insistent with each visit. His research funding was mysteriously cut, his laboratory access restricted, and colleagues who had once been friendly began avoiding him in the hallways. "They're isolating me systematically," he wrote. "Academic warfare is more subtle than the military kind, but just as effective." The decision to disappear had been gradual, according to the journal. Hartwell had begun moving his equipment and research notes in small batches, preparing this remote cabin as a sanctuary where he could continue his work away from corporate pressure. The location had been chosen carefully, far enough from civilization to avoid casual discovery, but accessible enough that he could maintain the supplies and equipment necessary for his research. Daniel found himself deeply moved by Hartwell's dedication and growing isolation. Here was a man who had sacrificed career, comfort, and human connection in service of an idea that could benefit all humanity. The parallels to his own situation weren't lost on him. Both men had lost what they valued most. Hartwell, his freedom to pursue truth; Daniel, his family's happiness and security. Both had found themselves facing choices that would define not just their futures, but their fundamental character. The journal entries describing Hartwell's final months at the university were particularly poignant. "I realize today that I may never see another human being who truly understands what I'm trying to accomplish," he had written. "The loneliness is the price of integrity, but some prices must be paid regardless of the cost." Reading those words, Daniel felt a kinship with this man he'd never met, recognizing the same bone-deep weariness that came from carrying a burden too heavy to share. Hartwell's technical achievements were remarkable, but his observations about human nature were equally insightful. He wrote extensively about the corruption of good intentions, about how organizations that began with noble purposes inevitably became focused on self-preservation rather than their original missions. "The tragedy," he noted, "is not that evil men seek to suppress good ideas, but that good men become evil through the gradual compromise of their principles." The cabin itself, Daniel learned, had been built over the course of 2 years, using techniques Hartwell had researched in books about frontier construction. Every log had been selected and placed by hand, every joint crafted to last for generations. "If my work survives me," Hartwell had written, "it will be because I created a sanctuary worthy of preserving it. This place must be more than a hiding spot, it must be a temple to the possibility of human progress." The most intriguing entries dealt with Hartwell's experiments in the cabin's hidden laboratory. Apparently, the main room was only the beginning. Somewhere in this structure were workshops and storage areas containing the actual fruits of his lifelong research. "Today, I successfully powered the entire cabin for 6 hours, using a prototype no larger than a paperback book," one entry proclaimed. "The implications are staggering, but so is the responsibility. This technology could eliminate energy poverty worldwide, or it could be weaponized in ways I prefer not to contemplate." As Daniel read deeper into the journal, he began to understand that Hartwell's isolation had been more than just physical. The man had been carrying the weight of world-changing knowledge, aware that his discoveries could either liberate humanity or become tools of oppression, depending on who controlled them. The loneliness wasn't just about being physically alone, it was about being the sole guardian of something too important to trust to anyone else. The final entry Daniel could read in his dying flashlight described Hartwell's growing certainty that his time was running out. "They found the cabin," he wrote. "I saw tire tracks on the access road that I didn't make, and yesterday I found footprints near the hidden entrance to the laboratory. Tomorrow I begin implementing the final protocols. If someone worthy finds this journal, they will also find the keys to understanding what I've accomplished here. If they prove themselves wise and trustworthy, they will inherit not just my discoveries, but the obligation to use them for the benefit of all humanity." The flashlight finally died completely, plunging Daniel and the dog into total darkness. But instead of feeling trapped or anxious, Daniel experienced a strange sense of peace. The cabin's atmosphere was so welcoming, so full of gentle presence, that the darkness felt protective rather than threatening. Beside him, the dog's steady breathing provided a rhythmic comfort that reminded him of the nights when Meera was younger and would fall asleep in his lap while he read her bedtime stories. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that might be different from the slow decline he'd been expecting. Hartwell's story was inspiring not just because of his scientific achievements, but because of his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, despite the cost. Here was a man who had faced impossible choices and made them based on principle rather than personal benefit. As Daniel sat in the darkness, surrounded by decades of one man's dedication to improving the world, he began to understand that his discovery of this place was indeed no accident. Somehow, the dog had known he needed to find not just shelter from the storm, but hope for the future. Daniel woke to filtered sunlight, streaming through the ivy-covered windows, disoriented and stiff from sleeping on the cabin's wooden floor. The dog was gone, but he could hear movement outside, the soft padding of paws and the occasional snap of a twig. His watch showed 6:30 a.m., which meant he'd been away from home for nearly 10 hours. Panic shot through him as he thought of Meera waking up to find him absent, of Mrs. Chen's worried phone calls, of all the ways his impulsive decision might have consequences he hadn't considered. But as he stretched and looked around the cabin in the morning light, the panic faded into something more complex. The place was even more remarkable than he'd realized in the darkness. Sunlight revealed intricate woodwork, handcrafted furniture that showed both skill and patience, and books whose titles suggested interests ranging from advanced physics to philosophy to poetry. This wasn't the refuge of a hermit, it was the home of a Renaissance man who had chosen solitude over compromise. The journal lay open where he'd left it on the desk, and in the better light, Daniel could see more entries than his failing flashlight had revealed. Before leaving, he needed to understand more about what Hartwell had discovered and why it had been important enough to sacrifice everything for. The scientist's story was compelling, but Daniel needed to know whether the man's claims about revolutionary technology were real or the fantasies of an isolated genius who had lost touch with reality. The dog returned as Daniel was examining a bookshelf filled with technical manuals and scientific journals. The animal looked remarkably better than it had the night before. The limp was barely noticeable, and its coat seemed healthier, less matted. It carried something in its mouth, a set of keys attached to a hand-carved wooden fob in the shape of a small tree. "What have you found, boy?" Daniel asked, accepting the keys from the dog's mouth. The animal wagged its tail and moved toward the fireplace, where Daniel now noticed irregularities in the stone pattern that suggested hidden functionality. Following the dog's lead, he discovered that several stones could be pressed in a specific sequence, revealing a narrow opening that led deeper into the structure. The keys fit perfectly into a lock Daniel hadn't seen until he was directly in front of it. Beyond the hidden door lay a workshop that belonged in a university laboratory rather than a remote mountain cabin. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with equipment Daniel recognized from his basic college science courses, mixed with devices that looked decades ahead of anything he'd ever seen. The air smelled of metal and electricity, with an underlying ozone scent that suggested sophisticated electrical work. But it was the display case in the center of the room that captured Daniel's attention. Inside, arranged with museum-like precision, were a dozen small devices that looked like nothing more than metallic cylinders about the size of a smartphone. A handwritten placard identified them as molecular energy storage units, prototypes 1, 12. According to the notes, prototype 12 could store enough energy to power an average home for 6 months. Daniel stared at the devices, trying to comprehend their implications. If Hartwell's claims were accurate, any one of these cylinders represented a revolution in energy technology. Scaled up and mass-produced, they could eliminate energy poverty worldwide, reduce environmental impact, and fundamentally change the global economy. The potential was staggering, but so was the responsibility of possessing such knowledge. A detailed notebook lay beside the display case, filled with test results and performance specifications. Hartwell's handwriting documented years of refinement, each prototype building on the lessons learned from its predecessors. The final entries described prototype 12 as stable, efficient, and ready for wider testing, but noted concerns about premature disclosure and the ethical implications of revolutionary change. The workshop contained other marvels as well. Solar panels that were apparently 10 times more efficient than commercial versions. Water purification systems that could process contaminated water using minimal energy. Even what appeared to be medical devices, though their purposes weren't immediately clear to Daniel. Hartwell hadn't just been working on energy storage, he'd been developing an entire suite of technologies designed to improve human welfare. As Daniel explored the workshop, the dog settled near the entrance with the patient demeanor of a security guard. There was something protective about its presence, as if the animal understood the importance of what surrounded them and was prepared to defend it. The relationship between the dog and this place was clearly more complex than Daniel had initially realized. The morning was advancing, and Daniel knew he needed to return home before Meera woke up and found him missing. But leaving felt like abandoning something precious, like walking away from a treasure that might disappear if left unguarded. The rational part of his mind insisted that he had responsibilities, bills to pay, a daughter who needed him. But another part, the part that had been dormant since Sarah's death, was awakening to possibilities he'd never imagined. His phone had no signal in the workshop, but Daniel estimated it would take him at least an hour to hike back to his truck, assuming he could find his way through the forest in daylight. As he prepared to leave, he found himself memorizing details of the workshop, trying to fix in his mind the location of the most important discoveries. Something told him this wouldn't be his last visit to Hartwell's sanctuary. The dog led him back through the forest by a different route than they'd taken the night before, one that was easier to navigate and seemed shorter. Daniel found himself wondering how many paths the animal knew, how long it had been serving as guardian of Hartwell's legacy. The creature moved with the confidence of long familiarity, pausing occasionally to ensure Daniel was keeping up, but never showing uncertainty about the direction. When they reached the road, Daniel's truck sat exactly where he'd left it, though in the morning light, the decision to abandon it for a midnight forest adventure seemed even more impulsive than it had felt at the time. The dog sat beside the vehicle as Daniel climbed in, and when he rolled down the window to say goodbye, the animal approached and rested its chin on the doorframe. "I'll be back," Daniel promised, though he wasn't sure when or how. The dog seemed to understand, stepping back as Daniel started the engine, but not moving from the roadside until the truck was out of sight. The drive home gave Daniel time to process what he'd experienced, but also raised troubling questions about his judgment and priorities. He'd spent the night exploring a stranger's abandoned cabin, instead of being home with his grieving daughter. He'd been so captivated by Hartwell's story that he'd temporarily forgotten his own responsibilities. Was this the beginning of healing and new possibilities, or was he running away from problems that required his immediate attention? Mrs. Chen was waiting in the kitchen when Daniel arrived, her expression a mixture of relief and gentle reproach. "Meera's still sleeping," she said quietly. "I told her you had to work late, but she kept asking when you'd be home. She's never done that before." The words hit Daniel harder than any criticism could have. In the 3 months since Sarah's death, Meera had shown no interest in his comings and goings, accepting his presence or absence with the same detached compliance she showed toward everything else. If she'd been asking about him, it might mean she was beginning to emerge from her protective shell exactly when he'd chosen to disappear on a personal adventure. As Mrs. Chen gathered her things to leave, Daniel found himself looking at his home with new eyes. The accumulated bills on the kitchen counter, the photographs that had become sources of pain rather than comfort, the silence that had settled over their lives like dust, everything seemed smaller and more manageable in light of what he'd discovered. Hartwell's legacy wasn't just about revolutionary technology, it was about the possibility of transformation, the idea that even the most desperate circumstances could be the beginning of something extraordinary. But transformation required wisdom, and Daniel wasn't sure he possessed enough to navigate the choices ahead. Hartwell's story was inspiring, but it was also cautionary. The scientist had sacrificed human connection for the pursuit of a greater good, choosing isolation over compromise. Was that a path Daniel was prepared to follow? And more importantly, what would be the cost to Meera if he did? 3 days after his first visit to the cabin, Daniel found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. His shifts at the hospital passed in a haze of distraction, with colleagues asking if he was feeling well and supervisors reminding him to stay focused during emergency calls. At home, he caught himself staring out the window toward the mountains, wondering what other secrets Hartwell's workshop might contain and whether the dog was still guarding the hidden sanctuary. His attempts to research Professor Edmund Hartwell online had yielded frustratingly little information. A few academic papers from his early career at Stanford, a brief mention in an article about alternative energy research, and then nothing. It was as if the man had simply vanished from the public record, which Daniel now understood was exactly what Hartwell had intended. The thoroughness of his disappearance suggested careful planning and resources that went far beyond what a typical professor could access. But Daniel's deeper investigation had revealed something troubling. While searching through old newspaper archives, he'd found a small item from 23 years ago reporting that Professor Edmund Hartwell had been found dead in his Stanford laboratory, apparently from a heart attack while working late. The brief article mentioned that he'd been under stress due to disputes with corporate sponsors and that his research materials had been secured by university administrators pending legal review. The implications were staggering. If Hartwell had been declared dead, then his survival and the cabin's existence were secrets that someone had worked very hard to maintain. But who? And why had they allowed the charade to continue for over 2 decades? Daniel found himself looking over his shoulder as he walked to his truck after work, wondering if his own research had attracted unwanted attention. The financial pressure at home continued to mount. Another overdue notice had arrived for the mortgage, and Daniel's reduced hours at the hospital weren't generating enough income to cover their basic expenses. Sarah's life insurance settlement was still tied up in legal proceedings, and the lawyer's latest estimate pushed the resolution back another 3 months. Daniel had finally swallowed his pride and applied for county assistance programs, but the paperwork was overwhelming and the waiting lists were long. The breaking point came when he found Meera sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah's jewelry box open in front of her. She was holding her mother's wedding ring, turning it over in her small fingers with the careful attention she used to give to her favorite toys. When she noticed Daniel watching, she looked up with eyes that held more awareness than he'd seen in months. "Are we going to sell Mommy's ring?" she asked quietly, the first complete sentence she'd spoken since the accident. Daniel's heart broke and soared simultaneously. His daughter was speaking again, but her first words revealed that she understood their financial situation better than he'd realized. How long had she been listening to his phone conversations with creditors, watching him sort through bills with increasing desperation, absorbing the stress he'd tried so hard to hide from her? "No, sweetheart," he said, sitting beside her and gently taking the ring. "We're not going to sell Mommy's ring. We'll find another way." But even as he spoke the words, Daniel wasn't sure how he could keep that promise. The ring was worth several $1,000s, enough to buy them a few more months of stability while he figured out a longer-term solution. The practical part of his mind insisted that Sarah would have wanted him to use whatever resources were available to take care of their daughter. The emotional part rebelled against the idea of trading away the symbol of their love for something as mundane as mortgage payments. That evening, after Meera had gone to bed, Daniel found himself driving toward the mountains again. He told himself he was just going to check on the cabin to make sure vandals hadn't discovered it or weather hadn't damaged Hartwell's precious legacy. But the truth was simpler. He needed to be in a place where hope felt possible, where the accumulated weight of grief and responsibility didn't press down on him quite so heavily. The dog was waiting for him at the same spot where they'd first met, as if it had been watching the road and anticipating his return. This time, the animal showed no signs of injury or distress. Its coat was full and healthy, its movements fluid and confident. In the beam of Daniel's flashlight, the dog's eyes held an intelligence that went beyond normal animal, our Renessa depth of understanding that suggested it knew exactly why Daniel had returned. The cabin felt like coming home. The workshop secrets called to him, and Daniel spent hours examining Hartwell's devices and reading through technical notes that were gradually becoming more comprehensible. The scientist had been meticulous in his documentation, creating step-by-step explanations that assumed his eventual reader would need to understand not just what he'd accomplished, but how to build upon it. One device in particular caught Daniel's attention, a medical scanner that Hartwell claimed could diagnose cellular damage with unprecedented accuracy. The notes described it as a prototype for early cancer detection, capable of identifying malignant changes years before they would show up on conventional tests. For someone who'd spent his career as a paramedic, the implications were immediately obvious. Such a device could save millions of lives if it could be developed and distributed widely. But as Daniel studied the technical specifications, he began to find evidence that supported his growing suspicions about the dangers surrounding Hartwell's work. Hidden among the workshop papers were photographs taken with a telephoto lens, showing men in business suits examining the outside of the cabin. The images were dated just weeks before Hartwell's supposed death, and handwritten notes on the back identified some of the men as executives from major energy corporations. Another folder contained correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of corporate espionage and intimidation. Letters from lawyers threatening patent lawsuits, reports of break-ins at Hartwell's university office, and even what appeared to be surveillance logs documenting his daily routines. The professor hadn't been paranoid, he'd been the target of a systematic campaign to acquire his research by any means necessary. The most chilling document was a typed memo on corporate letterhead, apparently leaked by a sympathetic employee, outlining a strategy to neutralize the Hartwell problem through acquisition of assets following natural resolution of personnel issues. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the implications. Someone had been planning to wait for Hartwell to die and then claim his research as abandoned property. But Hartwell had outmaneuvered them by faking his own death and disappearing with his life's work. The cabin represented more than just a retreat from corporate pressure. It was a fortress designed to preserve revolutionary technology until it could be entrusted to someone who would use it responsibly. As Daniel read deeper into Hartwell's files, he began to understand that the scientist had been preparing for this moment for years. References throughout his notes mentioned the eventual guardian and my chosen successor, as if he'd always known that someone would eventually find the cabin and inherit its secrets. The detailed explanations, the carefully preserved equipment, even the dog's apparent immortality, everything had been arranged to ensure that Hartwell's legacy would survive until the right person came along. The weight of that realization was almost overwhelming. Daniel had stumbled into this situation by accident, following an injured dog on a night when his own life had reached its lowest point. But according to Hartwell's notes, there were no accidents where the cabin was concerned. The professor had designed systems and safeguards that would lead only worthy individuals to his sanctuary, filtering out those who might misuse his discoveries. The dog watched Daniel with patient attention as he worked through the implications. If Hartwell was right, then Daniel's discovery of the cabin wasn't random chancete, was the result of years of planning by a man who'd trusted that the right person would eventually find their way to his door. The question was whether Daniel was actually worthy of that trust, or whether his desperate circumstances had simply made him the first person desperate enough to follow a mysterious dog into the wilderness. By the time Daniel prepared to leave the cabin, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. He'd been gone all night again, but this time he felt less guilty about it. Meera's breakthrough the previous day, her first real words in months, suggested that his own healing might somehow be connected to hers. Perhaps his discovery of hope in Hartwell's legacy was already beginning to change the atmosphere at home, giving his daughter permission to emerge from her protective silence. But as Daniel hiked back toward his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed different than it had on his previous visits, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder for signs of movement in the shadows. The dog stayed close, its alert posture suggesting that it too sensed potential danger. When they reached the road, Daniel's truck was exactly as he'd left it, but something felt wrong. The vehicle looked undisturbed, but there were fresh tire tracks in the soft shoulder nearby tracks that didn't match his own tires. Someone else had been here recently, and they'd been interested enough in his truck to stop and examine it. The dog growled softly, the first sign of aggression Daniel had seen from the animal. Its attention was focused on the tree line across the road, where shadows could easily conceal an observer. Daniel followed the dog's gaze but saw nothing unusual, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. As he drove home, Daniel realized that his discovery of Hartwell's cabin had moved beyond personal healing and entered dangerous territory. The same corporate interests that had driven the professor into hiding were apparently still active, still searching for the technology they'd tried to acquire decades ago. And now, through his own careless research and repeated visits to the cabin, Daniel might have led them straight to their prize. Daniel's paranoia proved justified 3 days later when he noticed the same dark sedan parked at different locations throughout his day outside, the hospital during his shift, across from Meera's school during pickup, and later that evening, positioned with a clear view of their house. The surveillance was subtle but persistent, the kind of professional observation that suggested resources and planning far beyond what casual curiosity would require. The realization that he and Meera might be in danger transformed everything. The cabin had felt like a sanctuary, a place where healing and hope were possible, but now it seemed he'd inadvertently drawn predators toward the very thing he'd grown to treasure. His attempts to research Hartwell online had left digital footprints, and his repeated nighttime absences had probably been noticed by neighbors who might innocently mention unusual activity to the wrong people. That evening, Daniel made a decision that went against every protective instinct he'd developed as a father. He was going to bring Meera to the cabin. The thought of exposing his daughter to potential danger made his stomach clench with anxiety, but keeping her at home while unknown watchers circled their house felt even more dangerous. At least at Hartwell's sanctuary, they would have the dog's protection and access to technology that might level the playing field against corporate adversaries. The conversation with Meera was the most honest they'd shared since Sarah's death. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed and explained, in age-appropriate terms, that he'd discovered something important that some bad people wanted to take away. He told her about the cabin, about Professor Hartwell's incredible inventions, and about the dog who had led him to secrets that could help many people if they were protected from those who would misuse them. "Is it dangerous, Daddy?" Meera asked, her voice small but clear. The fact that she was speaking in full sentences again filled Daniel with both hope and heartbreak. His daughter was emerging from her silence just as their world was becoming more complicated. "It might be," Daniel admitted, "but I think we'll be safer together than apart. And there's someone I want you to meet, a very special dog who I think will like you as much as I do." Meera considered this with the gravity that children bring to important decisions. "Will the dog protect us like the ones in the movies?" "I think this dog is even better than the ones in movies," Daniel said, and meant it. They left the house at midnight, taking only essential supplies and leaving lights on timers to suggest normal activity. Daniel had spent the afternoon preparing for the possibility that they might need to stay at the cabin for several days, packing Meera's favorite clothes and books, along with medical supplies and non-perishable food. If corporate hunters were closing in, he wanted to be ready for an extended siege. The dog was waiting at their usual meeting spot, but its behavior was different, more alert, more protective. When it saw Meera climbing out of the truck, the animal approached slowly, allowing the little girl to extend her hand for inspection before accepting her gentle touch. The connection between them was immediate and profound, as if they recognized something essential in each other. "He's beautiful," Meera whispered, running her fingers through the dog's thick fur. "What's his name?" Daniel realized he'd never thought to ask, had never seen the animal respond to any particular call. But as if understanding the question, the dog moved to a fallen log and used its paw to clear away leaves and debris, revealing letters carved into the wood. "Guardian." "Guardian," Meera repeated, and the dog's tail wagged in response. "That's a perfect name for someone who protects important things." The hike to the cabin took longer with Meera, but Guardian seemed to understand the need for patience, choosing the easiest paths and pausing frequently to ensure the little girl wasn't getting tired. Daniel found himself marveling at the animal's intelligence and consideration qualities that went far beyond normal canine behavior and into territory that suggested something truly extraordinary about Hartwell's final years in the forest. When they reached the cabin, Meera's reaction was everything Daniel had hoped for and more. Her eyes widened with wonder as she took in the moss-covered walls and ivy-draped windows, the fairy tale quality of a structure that seemed to exist at the boundary between human creation and natural magic. But it was her response to the interior that told Daniel he'd made the right decision. "It feels safe here," she said simply, settling cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, while Guardian curled up beside her. "Like nothing bad can happen in a place this peaceful." For the first time in months, Daniel saw his daughter relax completely. The tension that had become her constant companion since the accident seemed to dissolve in the cabin's warm atmosphere, and when she began asking questions about the books on Hartwell's shelves, Daniel heard curiosity and engagement that had been absent from her voice since Sarah's death. "The man who lived here was very smart," Daniel explained, pulling down a volume of poetry that seemed more accessible than Hartwell's technical manuals. "He spent his whole life trying to make things that would help people, but some selfish people wanted to stop him." "Is that why he had to hide?" Meera asked, and Daniel was struck by how quickly she'd grasped the essential conflict. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes good people have to hide from bad people until they can find someone trustworthy to help them." Meera absorbed this with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to complex moral situations. "And he chose you to help him?" The question caught Daniel off guard, forcing him to confront the implications of his situation. Had Hartwell somehow chosen him, or had he simply been lucky enough to follow Guardian on a night when desperation made him open to possibilities he would normally dismiss? The evidence suggested intentionality, the dog's appearance at exactly the right moment, the careful preservation of the cabin and workshop, the detailed notes that seemed designed for someone with Daniel's background and moral compass. "I think maybe he did choose me," Daniel said finally, "or maybe he set things up so that the right person would eventually find this place when they needed it most." As if to confirm his words, Guardian rose and moved toward the hidden entrance to the workshop. The dog had never led Daniel there directly before, had always waited for him to discover things in his own time. But with Meera present, the animal seemed more willing to accelerate the process of revelation. The workshop's wonders were even more impressive through Meera's eyes. She approached each device with the fearless curiosity of childhood, asking questions that forced Daniel to think more deeply about Hartwell's achievements. Her presence somehow made the space feel complete, as if the laboratory had been waiting not just for a worthy guardian, but for a family that could appreciate both the scientific marvels and the human dedication they represented. "Daddy, look at this," Meera called from a corner of the workshop Daniel hadn't fully explored. She was standing in front of a covered easel, and when she pulled away the cloth, it revealed not a scientific diagram, but a paintinga portrait of a family that looked remarkably like Daniel and Meera themselves. The style was amateur but heartfelt, showing a man and a young girl walking through a forest with a large dog at their side. The man's face wasn't quite Daniel's, and the girl wasn't exactly Meera, but the resemblance was strong enough to be unsettling. At the bottom of the canvas, in the same careful handwriting Daniel knew from the journals, were the words, "For those who will come after, when the time is right." "Did he paint us before he met us?" Meera asked, with the directness that children bring to inexplicable things. Daniel stared at the painting, trying to process its implications. The artwork was clearly old. The paint had the settled quality of something created years ago, and the canvas showed signs of age. But the resemblance to him and Meera was too strong to be coincidental. Had Hartwell somehow foreseen their coming, or was this another example of the strange connections that seemed to surround the cabin and its guardian? "I think he painted his hope," Daniel said finally. "He hoped that someday people like us would find this place and take care of the things he'd created." Meera nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 8-year-old understanding of how the world worked. "Can we stay here tonight? Guardian looks like he wants us to." Looking at the dog, Daniel saw that Meera was right. The animal had positioned itself near the workshop entrance with the alert posture of a sentry, but its expression was peaceful and content. For the first time since Daniel had known the creature, Guardian looked truly at rest, as if its long vigil was finally complete. "Yes," Daniel said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I think we're supposed to stay here tonight." As they settled in for the evening, Meera curled up on a pile of blankets with Guardian beside her. Daniel found himself thinking about families and legacy, about the ways that love and responsibility could transform ordinary people into guardians of extraordinary things. Hartwell had chosen isolation to protect his discoveries, but perhaps what the world really needed wasn't a solitary genius hoarding revolutionary technology. It needed a family willing to share those gifts responsibly with a world that desperately needed them. Outside the cabin, the forest was unusually quiet, as if even the night creatures understood that something important was happening in the hidden sanctuary. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful evening was the calm before a much more dangerous storm. Daniel woke to find Meera kneeling beside Guardian, her small fingers tracing something metallic partially hidden beneath the dog's thick fur. In the morning light, filtering through the cabin's windows, he could see what had captured her attention, a collar so tarnished with age that it had become nearly invisible against the animal's dark coat. "Daddy, look," Meera whispered, carefully working to free the collar from where it had become embedded in Guardian's fur. "There's writing on it." The dog remained perfectly still as Meera worked, showing a patience and trust that spoke to the deep connection they'd formed overnight. When she finally freed the collar, Daniel could see that it was made of silver, blackened with decades of tarnish but still bearing clear engravings on its surface. With trembling hands, Daniel took the collar and angled it toward the light. The inscription was in the same careful script he'd come to know from Hartwell's journals. "Guardian, faithful companion to Edmund Hartwell, born 2003, forever loved." The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. If the collar was accurate, Guardian had been born 22 years ago, which should make him an elderly dog nearing the end of his natural lifespan. But the animal beside them was clearly in his prime, strong, healthy, with the alertness and energy of a dog half that age. Either the collar was wrong, or something extraordinary had happened to extend Guardian's life far beyond normal canine limits. "That's impossible," Daniel murmured, but even as he spoke the words, he was remembering details that suddenly made terrible sense. Guardian's remarkable intelligence, his apparent immunity to injury, the way he seemed to understand human speech with uncanny accuracy. The dog hadn't aged normally because he couldn't age normally. Something had fundamentally altered his biology. Meera was studying Daniel's face with the careful attention children bring to adult reactions that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "What's wrong, Daddy? Is Guardian sick?" No, sweetheart, Guardian is. Daniel paused, trying to find words that would explain the impossible without frightening his daughter. Guardian is very special, more special than we realized. Moving to Hartwell's journal collection, Daniel began searching for entries that might explain what he'd discovered. It didn't take long to find references to experiments with biological preservation and cellular regeneration therapy. Hidden among the technical notes about energy storage and clean power were detailed observations about extending life itself. The relevant entries painted a picture of a man driven by loneliness to attempt something unprecedented. Hartwell had been working in isolation for years when Guardian had appeared as a puppy, apparently abandoned in the forest near the cabin. The scientist had taken in the young dog not just for companionship, but as a subject for his most ambitious and dangerous experiment. Day 1, 247 in isolation. One entry read, Guardian shows signs of advanced cellular degeneration consistent with a genetic disorder that will likely prove fatal within months. I cannot bear the thought of losing my only companion, and yet I cannot ethically test my cellular regeneration theories on a healthy animal. Perhaps Providence has provided both subject and justification for what I am about to attempt. The entries that followed documented Hartwell's careful application of his energy technology to biological systems, using Guardian as both test subject and beloved companion. The process had been risky several times. The dog had nearly died from the experimental treatments, but eventually Hartwell had achieved something that should have been impossible. Day 1, 456. Read a later entry. Guardian's cellular regeneration is now stable and self-sustaining. His physical age appears to have stabilized at approximately 2 years, and all indicators suggest the process is permanent. I have not only saved my companion's life, I have granted him immortality. The ethical implications are staggering, but I cannot regret preserving the life of the one being who has shown me unconditional love during my darkest years. Daniel sank into Hartwell's reading chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Guardian wasn't just an unusually intelligent dog, he was living proof that Hartwell's technology could extend life indefinitely. The implications for human medicine were beyond comprehension, but so were the potential consequences if such technology fell into the wrong hands. "Daddy," Meera's voice was small and concerned. "You look scared." Daniel forced himself to focus on his daughter, remembering that she was experiencing all of this through the lens of childhood wonder rather than adult anxiety about consequences and complications. To her, Guardian was simply a magical dog who protected important things and chose to love them. The technical details of how that magic worked were less important than the fact that it felt safe and good. "I'm not scared, sweetheart. I'm just surprised. Guardian is even more amazing than we thought." But privately, Daniel was terrified. If Hartwell had succeeded in creating immortality, then the corporate interests hunting for his technology weren't just seeking clean energy patents, they were after the secret to eternal life. The stakes were infinitely higher than he'd imagined, and the danger correspondingly greater. As if summoned by his fears, the sound of vehicles reached them through the forest, multiple engines, moving slowly but steadily in their direction. Guardian's head snapped up, his relaxed demeanor instantly transforming into high alert. The dog moved to the cabin's main window and peered through the ivy, his body tense with the controlled aggression of a predator preparing to defend his territory. "What is it?" Meera asked, moving to Daniel's side. Through the window, Daniel could see movement in the forest, at least 3 black SUVs navigating the rough terrain, with the kind of specialized equipment that suggested serious funding and professional preparation. The vehicles were still several hundred yards away, but they were moving directly toward the cabin with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. "We need to hide," Daniel said, his paramedic training taking over as he began assessing their options. The cabin had the hidden workshop, but if these people knew enough to find the location, they might also know about its internal layout. Guardian was formidable, but he was still just one dog against what appeared to be a coordinated team with unknown capabilities. As if reading his thoughts, Guardian moved to a section of the cabin wall Daniel had never paid attention to and began scratching at what appeared to be solid wood. But as the dog's claws found purchase, Daniel realized that the wall was actually a cleverly disguised door, painted and weathered to look like part of the original structure. Behind the hidden panel lay a narrow passage that led deeper into the hillside, clearly hand-excavated and reinforced with timber supports. Emergency supplies were stored along the walls: food, water, medical equipment, and what appeared to be communication devices. Hartwell had prepared for this exact situation, creating a bolt hole that could keep them safe while hostile forces searched the main cabin. "It's like a secret tunnel," Meera whispered with excitement, apparently viewing their situation as an adventure rather than a crisis. "Stay close to Guardian," Daniel instructed as they moved into the passage. "He knows where we're supposed to go." The tunnel extended much further than Daniel had expected, eventually opening into a natural cave system that Hartwell had modified into a fully equipped command center. Banks of monitors showed views from hidden cameras positioned throughout the forest, giving them a clear view of the approaching vehicles and their occupants. The people emerging from the SUVs were exactly what Daniel had feared: professionals dressed in dark, tactical clothing, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. They carried equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement would have, and their methodical approach to surrounding the cabin suggested extensive planning and preparation. One figure stood out from the others, a woman in an expensive business suit who seemed to be directing the operation from a position of clear authority. Even through the grainy monitor feed, Daniel could see that she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, regardless of obstacles or opposition. "Who are they?" Meera asked, pressed close to Daniel's side. "People who want to take Guardian and Professor Hartwell's inventions away from us," Daniel explained. "But we're not going to let that happen." Guardian moved to a control panel that Daniel hadn't noticed, stepping on specific floor plates in a sequence that activated the cave's defense systems. Hidden speakers crackled to life, and suddenly they could hear the conversation taking place outside the cabin. "Certain this is the location." The woman's voice was crisp and authoritative, with the slight accent of someone who'd spent years in international business. "Satellite imagery confirms regular foot traffic to this location over the past 2 weeks," replied one of the tactical team members. "Heat signatures indicate the structure has been occupied recently, possibly as recently as last night." "Then we proceed as planned." Dr. Chen's research suggests that Hartwell's technology is still intact, waiting for someone foolish enough to believe they can control it. "Find the laboratory, secure any prototypes, and eliminate any witnesses who might complicate our acquisition of the assets." The casual mention of eliminating witnesses sent a chill through Daniel that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. These weren't just corporate thieves, they were people prepared to kill to protect their interests, and he'd brought Meera directly into their path. But as he looked at Guardian, now fully alert and radiating an almost supernatural sense of protective purpose, Daniel realized that Hartwell's final guardian was exactly what the name implied. The dog hadn't led them to safety. He'd led them to a battlefield where the future of revolutionary technology would be decided by the courage of a grieving paramedic, a silent little girl, and an immortal dog who'd been waiting 20 years for this moment to arrive. The woman leading the assault team was Victoria Sterling, according to the identification documents Daniel found in Hartwell's intelligence files. She was a corporate acquisition specialist who'd built her reputation on obtaining sensitive technologies through methods that skirted the edges of legality. Her presence meant that someone with serious resources had finally located Hartwell's sanctuary and was prepared to claim his life's work by force. "Daddy, I'm scared," Meera whispered, pressing closer to Daniel as they watched the tactical team systematically search the cabin through the hidden cameras. "I know, sweetheart," Daniel replied, wrapping his arms around his daughter while his mind raced through their limited options. "But Guardian and I are going to keep you safe, I promise." The dog seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He'd positioned himself between Meera and the cave entrance, every muscle coiled with potential energy. But there was something different about Guardian's alertness, now a sense of anticipation rather than mere defensive readiness, as if he'd been preparing for this confrontation for years and was finally ready to fulfill his true purpose. Hartwell's command center contained more resources than Daniel had initially realized. Beyond the surveillance system, there were communication devices that could reach emergency services, detailed maps of the cave system showing multiple exit routes, and what appeared to be defensive measures built into the cabin itself. The professor had spent years preparing for this moment, creating layers of protection designed to give any worthy guardian the tools needed to preserve his legacy. "Found something," came Sterling's voice through the speakers. Her team had discovered the hidden entrance to the workshop, and Daniel watched through the cameras as they methodically catalogued Hartwell's visible inventions. The excitement in their movements was palpable. They knew they'd found something unprecedented. "Sir, these energy storage devices are exactly what Dr. Chen predicted," reported one of the tactical specialists, carefully lifting one of Hartwell's prototype batteries. "If his calculations are correct, this single unit could power a city block for months." Sterling's response was immediate and chilling. "Secure everything. We're not leaving anything behind that could compromise our exclusive access to this technology. And find the old man Hartwell may be officially dead, but someone's been maintaining this laboratory recently." Daniel realized with growing horror that they didn't know Hartwell was actually gone. The preservation of the cabin and workshop was so complete that Sterling's team assumed the professor was still alive and hiding somewhere in the forest. They would keep searching until they found him, or until they found Daniel and Meera instead. But Guardian had moved to another control panel, this one partially concealed behind what looked like natural rock formation. When the dog stepped on a specific sequence of stones, new displays activated throughout the command center. These weren't just surveillance monitors, they were diagnostic screens showing the status of systems Daniel hadn't known existed. The cabin wasn't just a laboratory and hiding place. It was a fortress, equipped with defensive measures that Hartwell had spent years perfecting. Automated systems could seal the structure, deploy non-lethal deterrents, and even create the illusion that the building was empty and abandoned. The professor had anticipated that his sanctuary would eventually be discovered by hostile forces, and he'd prepared accordingly. "Guardian," Daniel said quietly, "can you show me how to use these systems?" The dog moved to a leather-bound manual that had been waiting on a shelf marked "Emergency Protocols." As Daniel opened it, he found detailed instructions written in Hartwell's careful handwriting, explaining how someone with no technical background could operate the cabin's defenses in a crisis situation. "My eventual guardian," the introduction read. "If you are reading this, then the forces I have spent years avoiding have finally found my sanctuary. Do not despair. Everything you see around you was designed to give a worthy person the tools needed to protect what matters most. Trust in the systems I have created, trust in Guardian's wisdom, and trust in your own moral courage. The technology I have developed can change the world, but only if it remains in the hands of those who will use it responsibly." The manual's first section dealt with immediate survival, how to use the cave system's air filtration, water supply, and communication equipment to maintain safety during a siege. But the later sections addressed something far more complex: how to evaluate whether the people seeking Hartwell's technology were worthy of possessing it, and how to ensure that revolutionary discoveries would benefit humanity rather than enrich a small group of corporate shareholders. "Daddy, look," Meera said, pointing to one of the monitors. Sterling's team had found something that was making them excited: a heavy vault door hidden behind a false wall in the workshop. The door was clearly designed to protect Hartwell's most important discoveries, and their eagerness to open it was written on every face. But as Daniel watched, he realized that the vault's security system was more sophisticated than a simple lock. According to Hartwell's notes, it required not just the correct combination, but verification that the person opening it possessed both scientific understanding and moral integrity. The professor had designed it as a final test, ensuring that his most dangerous discoveries could only be accessed by someone who would use them wisely. Sterling was directing her technical specialist to override the vault's security, but their conventional approaches weren't working. The system had been designed by a genius who'd spent years anticipating every possible method of forced entry. Electronic hacking attempts triggered additional security layers, physical force activated defensive measures, and even chemical analysis of the air around the vault could detect hostile intent. "Sir, we're going to need more time," the specialist reported. "This security system is unlike anything I've seen. It's almost like it's designed to read the intentions of whoever's trying to open it." "Then we'll wait," Sterling replied coldly. "Post perimeter guards and prepare for an extended operation. Whoever's been maintaining this place will eventually return, and when they do, we'll persuade them to provide the access codes." The threat was clear, and Daniel felt his protective instincts flare with an intensity he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. These people were prepared to hurt innocent civilians to obtain technology they planned to exploit for profit. They represented everything Hartwell had tried to protect his discoveries from, and they'd made it clear that Meera's safety meant nothing to them. But as Daniel studied the manual's defensive options, he began to understand that Hartwell had anticipated this exact situation. The cabin's systems weren't just designed to hide from corporate hunters, they were designed to test them, to force them to reveal their true intentions and capabilities. Every challenge Sterling's team faced was providing information about their resources, their methods, and their moral boundaries. Guardian moved to Daniel's side and placed a paw on a specific page of the Manu Alpha section, dealing with active resistance protocols. The instructions were clear but sobering. If hostile forces threatened the sanctuary, the cabin's guardian was authorized to use any means necessary to protect Hartwell's legacy and prevent it from falling into unworthy hands. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked Guardian, though he wasn't sure if he was asking the dog or himself. Guardian's response was to move to Meera and gently guide her to a specially padded area of the command center that was clearly designed as a safe zone during emergencies. The dog's message was unmistakable. He would protect the child while Daniel dealt with the threats above. "Sweetheart," Daniel said, kneeling beside his daughter, "I need you to stay here with Guardian while I go upstairs. No matter what you hear, don't leave this spot unless Guardian tells you it's safe." Meera looked at him with eyes that held far too much understanding for an 8-year-old. "Are you going to fight the bad people?" "I'm going to protect Professor Hartwell's inventions," Daniel replied, "and I'm going to make sure they can't hurt anyone we care about. Will you come back?" The question nearly broke Daniel's heart, reminding him of all the promises that had been broken in their family's recent history. But looking at his daughter, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and protective measures of a man who'd sacrificed everything for the good of humanity, Daniel felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in months. "Yes," he said firmly, "I will come back. Guardian and I are going to make sure of it." As Daniel prepared to leave the command center, he found himself thinking about legacy and responsibility, about the ways that ordinary people could be called upon to protect extraordinary things. Hartwell had spent years preparing for this moment, creating systems and safeguards that would give his eventual guardian every possible advantage. But ultimately, the success or failure of protecting revolutionary technology would come down to the courage and moral clarity of a grieving paramedic who'd followed a mysterious dog into the wilderness on the worst night of his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, he'd been convinced that his life was over, that he had nothing left to offer the world except the basic competence needed to keep Meera fed and sheltered. Now he was the last line of defense for discoveries that could change the course of human history. But as he looked at Guardian, steadfast and ready beside him, Daniel realized that perhaps this was exactly what he'd been preparing for his entire life, the chance to save something that truly mattered. not just for his own family, but for everyone. Daniel emerged from the hidden passage into the workshop, just as Sterling's technical specialist was placing explosive charges around the vault door. The sight of destructive force being applied to Hartwell's carefully crafted sanctuary filled him with a rage he'd never experienced, not even in the immediate aftermath of Sarah's death. These people were destroying something irreplaceable in their greed for profit, treating decades of scientific achievement as nothing more than an obstacle to their acquisition plans. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Daniel said quietly, stepping into the workshop with his hands visible but ready. The reaction was immediate. 3 tactical team members spun toward him with weapons drawn, while Sterling herself smiled with the satisfied expression of a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. The specialist working on the vault continued his preparations, apparently confident that Daniel posed no threat to their operation. "Mr. Holt, I presume," Sterling said, consulting a tablet that apparently contained detailed information about Daniel's background. Paramedic, recently widowed, struggling with financial difficulties, and a daughter who stopped speaking since her mother's tragic death. "You've had a difficult few months." The casual invasion of his privacy was another violation, but Daniel forced himself to remain calm. Hartwell's manual had been clear about the importance of maintaining emotional control during confrontations with hostile forces. Every word, every gesture would be recorded and analyzed for weaknesses that could be exploited later. "My personal situation isn't your concern," Daniel replied. "But your presence here is mine. This is private property, and you're trespassing." Sterling laughed, a sound that contained no warmth or humor. "Private property belonging to a man who's been legally dead for over 20 years. Which makes this site abandoned, subject to salvage laws that give us every right to claim anything of value we find here." "Professor Hartwell isn't dead," Daniel said, watching Sterling's expression carefully. "And even if he were, that wouldn't give you the right to steal his life's work." "Hartwell is dead," Sterling replied with conviction. "We have documentation proving he died of a heart attack in his Stanford laboratory in 2001. What we're dealing with here is an elaborate hoax, probably perpetrated by academic colleagues who wanted to preserve his research for their own purposes." Daniel realized that Sterling genuinely believed Hartwell was dead, that she'd built her entire operation on the assumption that they were dealing with intellectual property theft rather than a living scientist's protected sanctuary. The implications were both encouraging and terrifying, because it meant they didn't know the full scope of what they were trying to steal, terrifying because their willingness to use violence suggested they viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in their acquisition strategy. "The technology here doesn't belong to you," Daniel said firmly. "It was created to benefit humanity, not to enrich corporations that will suppress it to protect their existing investments." "Naive idealism," Sterling dismissed. "Revolutionary technology requires massive resources for development and distribution. Private corporations are the only entities capable of bringing Hartwell's discoveries to market in ways that will actually help people. Leaving them buried in this mountain cave helps no one." As if summoned by Sterling's dismissive tone, Guardian appeared in the workshop doorway. The dog's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, introducing an element that Sterling's carefully planned operation hadn't accounted for. The tactical team members shifted nervously, apparently unsure how to classify a threat that walked on 4 legs and showed no fear of armed humans. "Interesting," Sterling observed, studying Guardian with the calculating attention of someone evaluating a potential asset. "Hartwell's famous companion, I assume. Our research indicated he had a dog, though the animal should have died of old age years ago." Daniel watched Sterling's face as she processed Guardian's appearance, seeing the moment when corporate avarice overcame rational skepticism. She was looking at the dog not as a potential threat, but as another valuable asset to be acquired. If Hartwell had somehow extended the animal's lifespan, then the biotechnology applications were worth more than the energy storage devices combined. "Stand down, Guardian," Daniel said quietly, hoping the dog would understand that he was buying time rather than surrendering. These people aren't going to hurt us. But Guardian didn't stand down. Instead, the dog moved deeper into the workshop, positioning himself between Daniel and the explosive devices that threatened the vault. His posture was alert, but controlled, suggesting intelligence and purpose that went far beyond normal animal behavior. "Remarkable conditioning," Sterling commented. "The animal shows no fear response whatsoever. Dr. Chen will be fascinated by the behavioral modifications Hartwell achieved." "Guardian isn't conditioned," Daniel replied. "He's intelligent, more intelligent than most people, and certainly more moral than anyone in this room." Sterling's smile faltered slightly, replaced by an expression of genuine curiosity. "You're suggesting the animal has been cognitively enhanced. That's even more valuable than life extension. A reliable method for increasing animal intelligence could revolutionize everything from agriculture to military applications." The casual discussion of Guardian as a potential military asset was the final straw for Daniel's patience. These people saw everything in terms of profit and exploitation, including a loyal companion who had spent decades protecting something precious. They represented exactly the kind of moral blindness that Hartwell had spent his life trying to circumvent. "The vault won't open for you," Daniel said, moving closer to the heavy door. "Hartwell designed it to respond only to people who understand what his work was really about." "We'll see about that," Sterling replied, nodding to her specialist to continue with the explosive charges. But as the man reached for his detonator, Guardian acted with speed that seemed impossible for any normal animal. The dog crossed the workshop in a blur of motion, disarming the specialist with precise application of force that left the man conscious but completely incapacitated. The tactical team members raised their weapons, but Guardian was already moving again, systematically neutralizing threats with surgical precision. Daniel stared in amazement as Guardian demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond enhanced intelligence or extended lifespan. The dog was moving with the calculated efficiency of a trained Special Forces operative, using knowledge of human anatomy and combat tactics that no animal should possess. Hartwell's experiments had created something unprecedented, not just an immortal companion, but a protector with abilities that bordered on the supernatural. "Impossible," Sterling breathed, backing away as her carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos. "Animals don't behave that way. They don't plan, they don't strategize." "Guardian does," Daniel interrupted, moving to the vault door as the workshop erupted in controlled violence. "Because he's not just an animal anymore. He's everything Hartwell hoped he could become." The vault's locking mechanism was exactly as Hartwell's manual had described, a complex system that required not just the correct combination, but verification of the operator's intentions and moral character. Daniel placed his hands on the designated sensors and spoke the words Hartwell had included in his emergency protocols. "For the benefit of all humanity, with wisdom and humility." The massive door began to open, revealing a chamber that contained the culmination of Hartwell's life, worked dozens of completed devices arranged with museum-like precision, each one representing a breakthrough that could transform human civilization. Energy storage units that could power cities, water purification systems that could eliminate scarcity, medical scanners that could detect disease at the cellular level before symptoms appeared. But it was the device in the center of the vault that took Daniel's breath away. No larger than a laptop computer, it hummed with barely contained energy that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with possibility. According to the placard beneath it, this was Hartwell's masterpiece, a clean energy generator that could provide unlimited power without fuel, without waste, without environmental impact of any kind. "My God," Sterling whispered, her corporate composure finally cracking as she saw the true scope of what Hartwell had achieved. "Do you have any idea what you're holding? That single device could make its owner the most powerful person on Earth." "That's exactly why it can't belong to someone like you," Daniel replied, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was touching. Behind him, Guardian had finished neutralizing the tactical team, leaving them conscious but completely unable to continue their assault. The dog now stood guard at the vault entrance, his presence a reminder that some things were worth protecting regardless of the cost. Sterling's desperation was palpable as she realized her carefully planned acquisition was slipping away. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that suggested genuine fear. "The corporations I represent have invested billions in locating Hartwell's technology. They won't simply walk away because one idealistic paramedic thinks he knows better than people who understand global economics. Then they'll have to learn to live with disappointment," Daniel said, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that Hartwell had carried for so many years. This wasn't just about protecting valuable technology, it was about preserving humanity's chance to solve its greatest challenges without surrendering control to those who would exploit desperation for profit. Hidden beneath the energy generator, Daniel discovered what appeared to be a final letter from Hartwell, sealed in protective material and marked, "For my chosen successor." His hands trembled as he opened it, aware that Sterling was watching his every movement while calculating her remaining options for salvaging the operation. The letter was brief but profound, written in Hartwell's familiar, careful script. "My friend, if you are reading this, then you have proven yourself worthy of inheriting not just my discoveries, but the burden of protecting them. I spent years believing that revolutionary technology required revolutionary sacrifice, that saving the world meant abandoning everything that made life worth living. I was wrong. The greatest discoveries mean nothing if they are not shared with wisdom and love. The power to change the world must remain in the hands of those who understand that true strength comes not from what we can control, but from what we choose to protect. Trust your heart, trust your family, and trust that Guardian will show you the path forward when the way seems unclear. The technology I have created was never meant to make anyone powerful, it was meant to make everyone free. Use it wisely, share it carefully, and remember that the most valuable thing you can pass on to the next generation is not wealth or knowledge, but the courage to do what is right, even when it costs everything. Your predecessor and friend, Edmund Hartwell." As Daniel finished reading, Sterling made her final desperate move. "If you won't cooperate willingly, then we'll take what we need by force," she declared, producing a weapon that had been concealed beneath her business suit. "Your daughter is still in this building somewhere, Mr. Holt. I'm sure you'll be more reasonable when her safety is directly at stake." The threat against Meera transformed Daniel completely. The grief and uncertainty that had defined his existence for months crystallized into a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. This woman was threatening the only thing in the world that mattered more to him than life itself. And in that moment, he understood exactly what Hartwell had felt when corporations had tried to steal his life's work. "You made a mistake," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made Sterling step backward. "Guardian, show her what happens to people who threaten Meera." The dog's response was immediate and terrifying. Guardian moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy physics, disarming Sterling before she could react, and pinning her to the workshop floor with precisely applied pressure that left her conscious but completely helpless. The animal's eyes, when they fixed on Sterling's face, held an intelligence that was unmistakably human in its moral judgment. "This is impossible," Sterling gasped, struggling futilely against Guardian's hold. "Animals don't, they can't." "Guardian isn't just an animal anymore," Daniel explained, beginning to understand the full scope of Hartwell's achievement. "He's what we could all become if we chose wisdom over greed, protection over exploitation. He's everything you and your employers will never understand." But Daniel's moment of triumph was interrupted by a sound that filled him with both joy and terror. Meera's voice, calling his name from somewhere in the cabin. His daughter had left the safety of the command center, possibly in response to the sounds of conflict above, and was now somewhere in the building with hostile forces still potentially active. "Daddy, where are you? Guardian said it was safe to come up." The relief in Meera's voice told Daniel that his daughter was no longer the silent, withdrawn child who had barely spoken since her mother's death. The adventure they'd shared, the mysteries they'd uncovered together, and the sense of purpose they'd discovered in protecting something precious had somehow restored her ability to trust the world enough to engage with it again. "I'm here, sweetheart," Daniel called back, securing Hartwell's master device while keeping a careful eye on the subdued tactical team. "Stay with Guardian while I finish up in here." But Meera appeared in the workshop doorway, her eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the aftermath of the confrontation. She showed no fear of the strangers or concern about the obvious signs of conflict. Instead, she moved directly to Daniel's side, with the confidence of a child who trusted that her father would protect her from anything dangerous. "Did the bad people try to steal Professor Hartwell's inventions?" she asked, studying Sterling with the frank assessment that children bring to adult behavior they find puzzling. "They tried," Daniel confirmed, "but Guardian and I stopped them." Meera nodded as if this outcome had been inevitable. "Guardian told me you would. He said some people try to take things that don't belong to them, but good people always find a way to stop them." Sterling stared at the little girl, with an expression that suggested she was finally beginning to understand what she'd been trying to destroy. Here was a family that had found healing and purpose in protecting something greater than their individual needs, demonstrating the kind of moral courage that corporations couldn't purchase or manipulate. "The technology belongs to everyone," Meera said with the simple directness that children bring to complex moral questions. "Professor Hartwell made it to help people, not to make some people richer than others." Daniel felt a surge of pride at his daughter's understanding, realizing that her recovery was complete in ways that went far beyond her willingness to speak again. She had found her voice, not just literally, but morally. She understood the difference between right and wrong in ways that many adults struggled with. "What happens now?" Sterling asked from her position on the floor, apparently recognizing that her mission had failed completely. Daniel looked around the workshop, taking in the revolutionary technology that could change the world if used wisely, the defeated corporate team that represented everything wrong with unchecked capitalism, and his daughter, who embodied hope for a better future. The decision that had seemed impossible when he first discovered the cabin now felt obvious. "Now we do what Professor Hartwell always intended," Daniel said, beginning to pack selected devices with careful attention to their potential impact. "We share these discoveries with people who will use them to help humanity, not exploit it for profit." "You can't just give away technology worth billions of dollars," Sterling protested. "Watch me," Daniel replied, understanding finally that the true value of Hartwell's legacy wasn't monetary. It was the possibility of a world where revolutionary discoveries belonged to everyone, where progress served human needs rather than corporate interests, and where families like his could find healing through protecting something worth preserving. Guardian released Sterling and moved to Meera's side, the dog's protective mission complete. The animal looked satisfied in a way that suggested years of waiting had finally come to an end. His vigil was over. His chosen successor had proven worthy, and the future of Hartwell's discoveries was secure in hands that would use them wisely. As Daniel prepared to leave the workshop with his daughter and their extraordinary companion, he realized that their adventure was just beginning. They had technology that could change the world, but more importantly, they had each other and the moral clarity to use their discoveries responsibly. The healing that had begun with following a mysterious dog into the wilderness was complete, replaced by a sense of purpose that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months later, Daniel sat on the porch of their new home, watching Meera play in the yard with Guardian, while the evening sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The house was modest but comfortable, purchased with carefully managed proceeds from the selective licensing of Hartwell's less sensitive technologies to organizations that had proven their commitment to humanitarian applications. The journal in Daniel's lap was his own creation, documenting their family's journey from grief and desperation to healing and purpose. Writing had become his way of processing the extraordinary changes in their lives, and he'd discovered that putting their story into words helped him understand how profoundly they'd all been transformed by following a mysterious dog into the wilderness on the worst night of their lives. "Daddy, look what Guardian found," Meera called, running toward the porch with something cupped carefully in her hands. Her voice was bright with excitement, full of the curiosity and joy that had slowly returned as their new life stabilized around shared purpose and mutual healing. In her palms lay a small device that Daniel recognized as one of Hartwell's medical scanners, apparently hidden in their yard by Guardian as part of some game or test. The dog had been teaching Meera about the professor's inventions gradually, allowing her natural intelligence to guide her understanding of how technology could serve human needs. "It's the one that can tell if people are sick before they feel bad," Meera explained, settling beside Daniel on the porch steps. "Guardian says we can use it to help our neighbors stay healthy." Daniel smiled at his daughter's instinctive grasp of how revolutionary discoveries should be applied. Over the past months, they'd quietly introduced several of Hartwell's innovations to their rural community water purification systems for families with contaminated wells, energy storage units for homes that couldn't afford rising electricity costs, medical devices for the local clinic that served patients too poor for expensive diagnostic procedures. Each application had been carefully chosen and monitored, ensuring that the technology served genuine human needs rather than creating dependency or disrupting established social structures. Daniel had learned from Hartwell's journals that revolutionary change was most effective when it happened gradually, implemented by people who understood both the capabilities and the responsibilities that came with extraordinary power. The corporate interests that had tried to steal Hartwell's legacy had not simply disappeared. Victoria Sterling's employers had attempted legal challenges, claiming rights to technology they insisted belonged to their industry rather than individual inventors or small communities. But the careful documentation Daniel had maintained, combined with expert legal assistance from organizations dedicated to protecting humanitarian innovations, had successfully defended their right to share Hartwell's discoveries as they saw fit. More importantly, the gradual release of selected technologies had created a network of beneficiaries who understood the value of what they'd received and were prepared to defend it from exploitation. Farmers whose crops now thrived with minimal water consumption, clinics that could diagnose diseases previously undetectable until too late, families whose homes were energy independent all, had become stakeholders in preserving the decentralized humanitarian approach that Daniel and Meera had chosen. Guardian had thrived in their new environment, though the dog's extraordinary nature remained a carefully guarded secret. To their neighbors, he was simply an unusually intelligent and well-trained companion who seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when people needed help. The animal's immortality and enhanced cognitive abilities were known only to Daniel and Meera, a trust that Guardian seemed to appreciate through his continued loyalty and protective vigilance. The healing that had begun in Hartwell's cabin had deepened into something neither Daniel nor Meera could have imagined during their darkest months of grief. They discovered that helping others through the application of revolutionary technology had given their own recovery a sense of meaning that purely personal healing could never have achieved. Sarah's memory lived on not through preserved mementos or unchanged routines, but through the positive impact their family was having on the world around them. Daniel's work as a paramedic had taken on new dimensions as well. Equipped with some of Hartwell's medical innovations, he could provide emergency care that exceeded anything available at major hospitals. Heart attacks could be detected hours before symptoms appeared. Trauma injuries could be assessed with unprecedented accuracy, and chronic conditions could be identified and addressed before they became life-threatening. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel had learned to balance revolutionary capability with human wisdom. Each technological application was evaluated not just for its potential benefits, but for its broader impact on the communities they served. Some of Hartwell's discoveries remained secured in the cabin's vault, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to handle their implications responsibly. "Are you writing about Professor Hartwell again?" Meera asked, leaning against Daniel's shoulder to peer at the journal pages. "I'm writing about us," Daniel corrected gently. about how we learned that the most valuable things can't be bought or sold. They can only be shared with people who understand their true worth. Meera nodded with the wisdom that children develop when they've been trusted with genuine responsibility, like how guardians shared the cabin with us when we needed it most. Exactly like that, Daniel agreed, thinking about the mysterious connections that had brought their family together with Hartwell's legacy at exactly the moment when all of them needed each other most. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful evening. The grief and desperation that had once seemed insurmountable had been transformed into purpose and hope, not through the erasure of their losses, but through the discovery that healing could happen alongside service to something greater than their individual needs. Guardian dozed peacefully at their feet, the immortal companion who had waited decades for the right family to discover Hartwell's sanctuary. The dog's vigil was complete, but his guardianship continued in new forms, protecting not just revolutionary technology, but the family who had proven worthy of inheriting it. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. There were more of Hartwell's discoveries to share, more communities to serve, and more opportunities to demonstrate how revolutionary change could happen through wisdom and compassion rather than force and exploitation. But for this moment, Daniel was content to sit with his daughter and their extraordinary companion, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky and feeling grateful for the mysterious ways that love and purpose could find each other even in the darkest times. They'd followed a wounded dog into the wilderness and discovered not just hidden treasure, but the healing power of protecting something precious for the benefit of all humanity. The journal entry Daniel wrote that evening was simple but profound. Today I understood that we were never meant to own Professor Hartwell's legacy. We were meant to be owned by it, in the best possible way. Some treasures are too valuable to possess. They can only be stewarded, shared, and passed on to the next generation, with the hope that wisdom will guide their use. We are not the owners of revolutionary technology. We are its servants, and in that service we have found the peace that neither grief nor wealth could provide. As they prepared for bed that night, Meera paused in the doorway of her room. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud of what we're doing?" Daniel considered the question carefully, thinking about Sarah's values and the conversations they'd shared about making the world better for their daughter's generation. "I think Mommy would be amazed at how brave and wise you've become," he said finally. "And I think she'd be proud that we found a way to help other families while we were learning to be okay again ourselves." Meera smiled with the contented expression of a child who has found her place in the world, then disappeared into her room with Guardian padding softly behind her. The dog had become her nighttime guardian as well, ensuring that the little girl who had stopped speaking from grief now slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrow's opportunities to help others through the careful application of extraordinary gifts. Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of his daughter settling into sleep while their immortal companion took up his protective post beside her bed. The silence in their home was no longer the heavy quiet of grief and isolation. It was the peaceful stillness of a family at rest, secure in their purpose and confident in their future. The wounded dog who had appeared on a dark mountain road had led them not just to hidden treasure, but to the understanding that some discoveries are too important to be kept secret and too valuable to be sold. In learning to protect Hartwell's legacy, they had found their own healing. In choosing to serve something greater than themselves, they had discovered what it truly meant to be home.